Cool. Hello, everyone. Hope everyone is doing well. Thanks for coming out. I'm doing this from Jojage, which has long been a meeting place of various First Nations, otherwise known as Montreal. This is the third session of the Canadian Foreign Policy Hour, and there's lots to discuss this week. There are no other guests. Last week we had a very good discussion with Dimitri Lascaris, who was on, and people can check that out on YouTube. My plan is to sort of have a guest maybe every other week, sort of sometimes depending on how many issues there are that are in the news. This week there's a lot of issues that are in the news that I wanted to touch on, so I'm going to get right to it. First of all, I think some people may have seen in the Globe and Mail, I think it was on Monday's paper, there was the Report on Business section had a front page story titled "Canadian Foreign Aid was discussed during Barrick tax dispute in Tanzania. Internal emails show." Very good article, very important article about the close ties between Global Affairs Canada, the Canadian High Commission in Tanzania, and the company. The backdrop to the article is that in 2017, there's a major conflict in Tanzania between the government, the new government, and the Barrick Gold, which has been mining in Tanzania for many years, incredibly controversial operations in the country. Its North Mara mine is the site of the worst human rights record of probably of any Canadian mining company over the past 15 years. Minimum dozens have been killed. I think there was a government inquiry that said 65 people had been killed at the mine. That was in 2017. The human rights groups actually put the number closer to 300 people, mostly people killed that are scratching for small bits of gold, scratching rocks for small bits of gold by security forces, police that are paid for by Barrick, and there's a whole relationship between the company and basically using the police as their private security. But the big conflict in 2017 was over the fact that the Tanzanian government was claiming that Barrick had basically stolen or had failed to pay billions and billions of dollars in royalties and tax, and basically had fleeced the country of huge amounts of wealth. Barrick Gold has all kinds of tax havens and a very elaborate structure of hiding what taxes it's paid and putting the costs in low tax jurisdictions and basically avoiding paying tax to different governments. And the Tanzanian government accused them of a huge amount of unpaid tax and royalties, and basically put all these restrictions on Barrick. The Canadian government went to bat for Barrick at a really high and aggressive level. And what this Globe Mail story showed, based upon the internal communiques from the Canadian government officials that were uncovered through access to information, was just the scope of this Canadian government effort and the fact that they basically threatened to cut off aid to the Tanzanian government if they didn't work with Barrick to deal with the conflict, right? So Canada is the fourth biggest donor to Tanzania, and here you have the Canadian government using their aid leverage over the Tanzanian government to serve the interests of a Canadian mining company that was accused of massive human rights, accused of stealing a bunch or failing to pay taxes, and also involved in massive human rights violations. And the talking points that they uncovered show that the Canadian High Commissioner was even basically told prepared to respond to the Tanzanian mining minister if the question of human rights violations came up, and basically justify, say, oh, this was in the past. Barrick Gold's, the human rights question has sort of been improved. So even like justifying the human rights violations, again, dozens and dozens of people killed at the mine. Some estimates go as high as 300 at that time, and you have the Canadian government really going to bat for Barrick at quite an extreme level, as the Globe and Mail business section showed. Ken Rubin, the access to information sort of guru in Ottawa, happened to be at the Canadian Association of Journalists conference I spoke at on Saturday, and he actually told me that my name came up in the internal emails, because I wrote an article back in 2017 about what was going on with Barrick in Tanzania, and I said basically that if the Trudeau government would back Barrick in Tanzania in this context, they would back any Canadian mining company in any context, because you can't find a worse violator of human rights than Barrick Gold among Canadian companies. And this, what was accused against them was, of quite significant proportions, and still the government was willing to back it. So apparently the Canadian officials were actually, I think that article was published on rabble.ca, not exactly published in like an important publication. Nonetheless, the Canadian officials were concerned by the question of what they were doing, I guess, getting wider attention. And Tanzania is one of the countries in this world where, and I would put the estimate, it's a very interesting question to delve into, and I don't have a precise number, but of countries where the number one issue Canadian diplomacy is about is mining, right? I estimate something around 50 countries, mostly in Africa, not entirely. I think countries like Mongolia, maybe some of the Central American countries, where the top item of what Canadian diplomats, the top concern is just basically Canadian mining companies' profits. That's the top item. So Tanzania is one of those countries, but there are probably about a quarter of the world's countries where that is the case, maybe even a higher percentage. Switching gears to somewhere else on the African continent, our international development minister, former defense minister Harjit Sajjan, visited Rwanda a couple of days ago, and he was photographed with Paul Kagame, the president of Rwanda. He also made an announcement as part of this Romeo Dallaire's child soldier project with the Rwandan government, and its donation, financial contribution that Canada made. And this is probably our top ally in sub-Saharan Africa, Paul Kagame. Paul Kagame, it has the most African blood of any individual on his hands. Paul Kagame is incredibly brutal dictator internally within Rwanda, but more significantly has wreaked mayhem across the Great Lakes region of Africa, but particularly in the Congo. And the fact that the Trudeau government is openly sort of allying with Kagame, including just before the pandemic, Trudeau met with Kagame, and the PMO's office put out this photo of him laughing with Kagame. So they wanted to show how close Trudeau is with Kagame. Canadian aid to Rwanda, you can't underestimate how horrible the stuff that Paul Kagame has been involved in. His record of, he's been involved in violently overthrowing governments from 86 in Uganda to his invasion of Rwanda in 1990, which ultimately leads to, they shoot down the plane and leads to the genocidal killing of 1994. Then in 96, his forces overthrow the government. They march 1,500 kilometers to Kinshasa and overthrow the government in Congo. And then when his allies turn on him, that he puts in place in Kinshasa in the Congo, when they turn on him, he reinvades in 1998 and unleashes an 8-country war where millions of people are killed. Since that time, Rwandan forces have had huge amounts of destabilizing Eastern Congo. And there's all these UN reports, and get into it, that accuse Rwandan forces of genocide in Eastern Congo and all kinds of horrors. But that has actually been rekindled in recent days and weeks. And now there's a conflict between the government, which had been quite pro-Kagame in Kinshasa, in Congo, basically accusing Rwanda of re-supporting the M23 rebels that have restarted fighting in Eastern Congo. And there's been sort of a diplomatic spat between Kinshasa and Kigali over the matter. And here you have Trudeau official openly allying with Kagame, who, again, not just violence all across the region, assassinations, repeatedly assassinating his opponents in South Africa, in the Burundi and Uganda and Kenya, close in the East Africa, but also in South Africa, and prominent opponents in a conflict with the South African government over that. But also he I guess it's about a year ago now, he kidnapped his most famous opponent, the Paul, I'm going to get the name wrong, famous with Hotel Rwanda. He kidnapped him from the UAE, I believe, and brought him and put him in jail in Rwanda. This is somebody who had a big Hollywood film done about him, and openly doing that, and yet here you have the Trudeau government continuing to ally with Kagame. It's quite remarkable, and really exposes this idea of caring about human rights, that's important to the Trudeau government or Canadian governments more generally. And the whole Rwanda question is actually quite fascinating. There's lots to discuss on that issue. If people want to get into it, I'm happy to get into that, and Canada's role in Romeo Dallaire. So, for instance, in all of propaganda of Canadian foreign policy, the biggest piece of, call it propaganda or information suppression or whatever you want to call it, is actually with regards to Romeo Dallaire. Romeo Dallaire I don't get into the whole background, but basically in the UN mission in 93, 94 in Rwanda, he was the head of the military part, and there was a head of the overall political head of the UN mission was a man by the name of Jacques Roger Boubou, who was the former foreign minister of Cameroon. Jacques Roger Boubou published an entire book called Le Patron de Dallaire Parle, so the boss of Dallaire speaks, which basically accuses Dallaire of having sided with Kagame and the RPF and a whole bunch of violations of UN rules and rights violations, etc. This book was published. I did a search of Canadian media on this book by Dallaire's boss during the UN mission, and I found that there was 5 mentions in Canadian media about Le Patron de Dallaire Parle. Only one of them, what you would call an actual sort of like review that was somewhat kind of correct, and the rest, a couple were letters, and one was just attacking the book. Now, when you punch in Romeo Dallaire and his book into a search of major Canadian dailies, I forget the number, but it's thousands of mentions. And then you punch it into Google, and there's thousands and thousands more mentions. So basically, it's allowable in the dominant Canadian media to portray Dallaire in this positive light. But when a former minister of an African country, in this case Cameroon, publishes an entire book challenging Dallaire's narrative about what happened in Rwanda, the media just doesn't care about the matter and just ignores it. Anyways, moving on to a different, more current issue, Iran. I'm sure people saw that the Soccer Canada canceled the football match between the Iranian football team and the Canadian team in Vancouver. I think this is definitely a unfortunate development. It followed Trudeau publicly criticizing Soccer Canada for hosting the match. and it flows from a broken promise of the Trudeau government, which was to have to restart diplomatic relations. Before they were elected in 2015, they said very clearly they will restart diplomatic relations with Iran. They failed to do that. There was some efforts to go down that path, and basically the pro-Israel lobby in this country was able to scuttle those efforts. And the B'nai B'rith boasted, when the football match was canceled a couple of days ago, B'nai B'rith boasted about their lawsuit against Soccer Canada had contributing to the decision to cancel the match. So they're very much openly saying they played a role in this, and it's a really kind of ugly instrumentalization of what was clearly a horrible thing that transpired, and the Iranian military was responsible for, which was shooting down the plane where I think about 200 people were killed, a lot of Iranian Canadians, 2 years ago. And basically the pro-Israel groups and other groups that have been hostile to Iran for a long time have really latched onto that to demonize the Iranian government, and partly legitimately and partly in a way that's full of double standards. So, for instance, the Iranian government, when you compare things to the Saudi monarchy, the Iranian government is very open and fair and free and women's equality and all these things compared to what's going on in Saudi Arabia. But in the case of Saudi Arabia, we continue to send light armored vehicles and sniper rifles and whatever to support the Saudi war on Yemen and Saudi Arabia's repression domestically. So it's just a football match, but it basically kind of further confirms this conflictual relation that Ottawa has with Iran. And if you go back in history and you look at Canada's support for the CIA, the British-American overthrow of democracy in Iran in 1953, if you look at Canada's support for the Shah in the 2 decades after that, it was very repressive regime. You have to look at this in a kind of broader context, where this idea that Canada is just sort of like a force for democracy and human rights is quite frankly laughable. Another issue that's another development that warrants a little bit of discussion is the whole banning of Huawei, the Chinese technology company, from Canada's 5G and 4G tech, the Wi-Fi, the new Wi-Fi system. I actually debated Port Coquitlam's mayor, the suburb of Vancouver, on the big corporate outlet CKNW in Vancouver about the banning of Huawei a few days ago. And it's kind of a difficult one for someone who considers himself a supporter of economic democracy and would call himself a socialist, to defend this multinational corporation that Huawei is. It's a big Chinese tech company. It's kind of considered the crown jewel of China's getting to be a major economic player in the world. So it's this big step forward for Chinese tech, but you have to look at this the banning in the context of basically conflict with China, right? And just a couple of days ago, we have Joe Biden saying that basically the U.S. would go to war if China tried to take control of Taiwan, which China, of course, considers part of its country, as does most of the world. And it's kind of a complicated question, but most of the world, of course, supports the one China policy. so that's the context. Kind of bigger context is basically it's a battle to keep China down that Washington is pursuing, and kind of ironically in this battle, the corporate interests tend to be the ones that are the more sort of their Canadian corporate interests tend to be the ones that are less conflictual. Those who are, the security apparatus and the intelligence agencies are the one that are really pushing the American sort of let's get into conflict with China kind of ethos or politics. But so basically, what's driving, it's the Five Eyes, right? Canada's participation in the Five Eyes intelligence alliance is what the rationale for why we have to ban Huawei, because all our Five Eyes allies. But who is the Five Eyes, right? The Five Eyes is, the US, Australia, New Zealand, UK, Canada. What connects those countries? Not that they have more English speakers, Nigeria or India have many more English speakers. What connects those countries is it's, Mother England and the 5 European settler colonies. So as people have pointed out, it's really a race-based intelligence alliance that is increasingly at the heart of Washington-led effort to try to contain China, its pivot towards China, and it's not what we want in terms when we talk about needing to overcome the climate crisis, needing to international solidarity to deal with things like the pandemic, etc. This sort of Cold War with China is just ramping up tensions. And as I mentioned, it's kind of an interesting dynamic where it's corporate Canada, most of corporate Canada, that's not excited by this challenge to China. They want to do business with China. They, case of the Canadian telecommunications companies, the banning of Huawei is costing them hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. But increasingly, the sort of militarist, the intelligence apparatus, the U.S. empire forces within this country have really taken a precedent over the sort of corporate interests that kind of want to do business with China, and that could very well lead us towards a increasingly dangerous path. Another issue that deserves mention is Canada announcing another $100 million in mostly artillery shells, 20,000 artillery shells to the Ukrainian military. The NDP, of course, unfortunately supported that, as do the other political parties. So this is just more weaponry that Canada is putting into Ukraine. At the same time, of course, as I've mentioned in previous discussions, nothing about negotiations, continued opposition to diplomatic solution. One kind of interesting development on Ukraine a couple of days ago was that Erwin Kotler's organization, the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights here in Montreal, they put out a report offering some sort of academic kind of prominent individual for backing for the claim that that Ukraine that Russia is committing a genocide in Ukraine, which I believe is not based in reality and designed to really ratchet up tensions. But it's very fascinating to see a group like Kotler's group, where they very much are aligned with empire. And while I believe Kotler himself is largely motivated by his Zionist anti-Palestinian outlook, they very much align with the ethos of U.S. empire across the board. The question of Ukraine brings me to a debate discussion I was engaged with on Saturday at the Canadian Association of Journalists conference. This was quite a enjoyable discussion. It's very rare that I get invited to this type of forum where Sasha Petrovic, the CBC international correspondent, was one of the panelists, and there were a bunch of top CBC people were in the room. And it was supposed to be, the title was Censorship, Journalism, and War. And it was supposed to be focused on Ukraine. And right off the hop, I described the story about that I wrote just before Russia's February 24th illegal invasion of Ukraine, about Murray Brewster. Murray Brewster is the senior defense or military reporter for CBC. And what I basically said in the story, as I relayed to this forum, was that you don't know, when seeing articles in the corporate media, I often wonder if the journalists are ignorant, they're lazy, or they are sycophants of power. And this story that I did, I basically concluded that Murray Brewster had to have been a sycophant of power, because if he would have just reported what he himself had reported years previous, it would have done a lot more for the Canadian reader or viewer to have a background of what was going on with the Ukraine. So Murray Brewster had published a very important investigative piece back in 2015 when he was with the Canadian Press, which showed that the Canadian embassy in Kyiv was given as a safe haven to opposition Maidan protesters for more than a week. That included, though this wasn't in Brewster's article, but other reports show that that included members of far-right group C14. A bunch of other revelations. The spokesperson for the Canadian embassy was a leading Maidan protester, right, during the upheaval of 2013, 2014. This was reported on by Brewster. Brewster had also, back in 2015, Brewster had also reported on the 2008 NATO convention, where the Harper government supported expansion of NATO into Ukraine, and that the Russian government was very hostile to that. That was in Brewster's article. Also, Brewster reported on the fact that Canada was training far-right forces in the Ukraine. So all this is context is very important for Canadians to understand. I forget when I wrote the article, but it was, February 15th, February 20th, just before the invasion, where there's lots of discussion about Russia in the media, and Brewster had published numerous articles. This was really important context to understand, to make sense of how Canada's tied to this growing tensions, growing conflict that ultimately led to this brutal, illegal Russian war. So I told this story about this, and I basically concluded that Brewster was a sycophant of power, not because if he was lazy, he just would have repeated what he'd already reported. This was less work to just repeat what you already reported, and he couldn't have been ignorant because he already reported on it. So I made this point. That, of course, that wasn't too popular with some of the room, and the head of CBC, editor-in-chief of and executive director of CBC News, Brody Fenlon, came to Brewster's defense from the floor, and but it basically unleashed was part of this sort of debate, which they basically tried to hone in on the propaganda around the Russian war and war in general was just RT. They had a person on who was in charge of the community channels, who was actually had been the provider of RT, and he told a story about how basically the minister just completely subverted the regulatory process for taking a station off of broadcasting, in this case RT, and how this is very 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 dangerous, and I totally agree with that point. But I think the question of RT is a very small sliver of the propaganda and the media manipulation and the disinformation and one-sided story of what's going on with the coverage of Ukraine, Russia, etc. In this debate, I told a story of having disrupted Foreign Minister Mélanie Joly, and I pointed out that when I did that 6 weeks ago or so, the Russian propaganda apparatus totally jumped on it. right? They loved it, right? I was invited on to I think it's called Russia One or Russian, basically the biggest Russian state channel. The RT, I think like the whole sort of like RT bots on Twitter and the whole, they translated a bunch of languages, I think mostly via the RT network and Sputnik or whatever. Like clearly the Russian propaganda apparatus that has some power got behind it and he tried to frame me as this like, they really like made me sound like I was this like, serious, really important author, and they're really kind of like bigged up this whole kind of thing. But what I pointed out in this discussion was that about 2 weeks before that, something very similar happened in the Canadian, North American, Western media apparatus, propaganda apparatus, you want to call it, which was that on that Russia state TV, Russia One or whatever it's called, a woman, a journalist went on and held a sign saying no war. I'm sure people saw this. It was all over the Canadian media. This person was viewed as this great dissident, this moral force, and et cetera, et cetera. And my point was that basically the way the Russian propaganda apparatus treated me was very similar to the way that the Western apparatus treated this Russian journalist. The only difference was that, or the main difference, we can get into some particulars, but the main difference was that the Western media apparatus is more powerful. So yes, the Russian state apparatus and media apparatus is significantly more powerful than the Haitian, media apparatus, but it's nothing compared to the Washington-led NATO Canadian media apparatus. And I'm not saying they don't function in exactly the same way either, and I'm going to get to that in a second. And this was a very interesting part of this discussion that came out, which is that at one point in this discussion, I asked the audience, about 30 people, all like, or almost all journalists, many of them prominent journalists. I said, which institution in this country has the biggest public relations apparatus? I asked the room. No one responded, and I'm not sure if no one knew, but no one seemed to know, which is that the Canadian military is the biggest public relations apparatus in this country. The fact that that's obscured is in itself part of how the media ecosystem and the propaganda, if you like, works. But no one in the room was aware that the military, and we don't know an exact number because the military doesn't provide the exact number. Embassy Magazine 6 or 7 years ago put it at 661 people that were full-time public relations employees of the Canadian military. Huge amount of people. If you go on their website, there's 50 different offices with phone numbers for the Canadian military public relations offices, right? Like all across the country, in every different community, different base, etc. And that's just the formal PR. And I'm not talking about their history department, I'm not talking about their university. They fund all kinds of stuff, a whole other element, but just basically dealing with the media. That's what most of those people do, is deal with the media. The head of CBC News, Brodie Fenlon, who was in the room, he got really angry about this point about the military being the biggest public relations apparatus, and he basically said, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. They don't tell us what to run, what to cover, right? So I had gotten them with this stat, was how they was framing it. No, it doesn't matter. They don't tell us what to cover. And I agree with that. They don't, it isn't, that's not how it works usually. It's not, the military comes in and says, don't publish that. Though there is actually a history, and I document that in my propaganda system book, where the Canadian military literally did tell the CBC not to publish things into the 1960s. The relations were so close that they actually did directly block things, but that's not mostly how it works. But how it does work is that if you have such apparatus, such public relations capacities, you have so much greater capacity to influence what's in the media. Right? How many people are working full-time PR for anti-war groups? Basically no one. Right? So one side has hundreds and hundreds of people working, getting the message out, right? And the other side has volunteers, has you and me and others who are, volunteering to, if we organize a demonstration, to put out a press release or, whatever. So obviously this has an impact. Now, the other part I think that kind of that sort of helps explain the head of CBC News's a kind of dismissal of the statistic is a perception about the Canadian military, right? He perceives the Canadian military as a sort of like, benign or benevolent institution. And as I pointed out, and I think it's unarguable, the Canadian military is aligned with the biggest purveyor of violence in the world, right? The US military. The Canadian military is so deeply integrated with the US military, and its whole ethos is basically how can we support the biggest purveyor of violence probably the world has ever seen. And also, as I pointed out in this thing, I think to this CBC editor's chagrin, was that if you look at the history of Canadian warfare, there's only one war, there's about a dozen wars, only one of them you could even argue was morally justifiable. That was World War II. All the others, Afghanistan, Libya, Yugoslavia, Iraq, first one in 90, Korea, World War I, Boer War, Sudan, none of those are justifiable. And so if you start from if you basically think the Canadian military is this benevolent institution, yeah, if you're the head of the CBC News, yeah, no big deal that they try to push stories on us. They're just this benevolent institution that's trying to do God's work or whatnot. Another thing, so Sasha Petrovic, the CBC international reporter who was on the panel, at one point he makes this point. He's basically trying to sort of say the Russians and the Chinese have repressive apparatus. He was careful. He didn't deny that there are pressures on Canadian media to sort of toe the line, but so he was careful to his credit. But he basically talked about how in these countries, in Russia and China, they create an atmosphere. You don't even have to repress the reporters. It creates an atmosphere where journalists sort of self-censor. So I responded to this by saying, okay, yeah, I believe that's undoubtedly the case. There is an atmosphere, no doubt, in major Russian media or Chinese media, and for that matter, Turkish media, and there are journalists feel pressure. That's everywhere, even in the best of media systems. But so I was like, well, what kind of atmosphere that exists in Canada where the Ottawa Initiative on Haiti? I asked the room, are you familiar with the Ottawa Initiative on Haiti? One person in the room was familiar with Ottawa Initiative on Haiti, and that's basically where in 2003, Canadian officials brought together French, American, and Organization of American States officials come together basically to plan the overthrow of the elected president, to put Haiti under UN trusteeship, and to recreate the Haitian military. That was all reported on in L'Actualité on March 15th of 2003. L'Actualité is Quebec's equivalent to Maclean's magazine. It was reported on by a very prominent Quebec journalist, Michel Vastel, and basically it was a trial balloon. The minister Paradis released this information to a close media friend, and to test to see what the reaction was, because this what they were planning on doing was quite a big deal. 13 months later, the elected president and thousands of elected officials are overthrown by the US, France, and Canada. Haiti was under UN trusteeship essentially for 17 years. The Haitian military has basically been recreated. So this was all reported on a year before the coup. I did a search of major Canadian dailies on the Ottawa Initiative on Haiti. Not one single English language mainstream journalist mentioned the Ottawa Initiative on Haiti. There's a few mentions by myself and a couple other Haiti solidarity activists who got it in a brief mention during a broader opinion piece, but of a major journalist, not one single mention. So we talk about an atmosphere, we talk about the atmosphere in Canada's media scope that would allow that to happen. We have to reflect on that atmosphere. That the Ottawa Initiative in Haiti, I should point out, was not basically covered by a major corporate outlet until 2020. And then in that case, Enquête, Radio Canada's Enquête, a major show, on the 10-year anniversary of the earthquake, they went down to Haiti, and the second half was in large part about the Ottawa Initiative in Haiti, and they interviewed Denis Paradis. And then, in large part, why that happened was because members of Solidarité Québec Haïti, we met up with the journalists, the Radio-Canada journalists, before they went down, and we actually, sent them a bunch of information. And basically 18 years later, or at that point, I guess it was, 17 years later from the meeting, the sort of political climate was like not so hot that they could report on it in quite a good and proper way. So I'm going to leave it at that, and now I'm going to play a video that was just. Got
it.
Justice Minister David Lametti recently held a press conference speaking about the constitutional rights of minorities in Quebec. Halfway through the press conference, Minister Lametti was interrupted by a radical activist named Yves Engler, who accused him and the Canadian government of supporting Israel, which he deemed an apartheid state that illegally recruits Canadians into the IDF, that kills Palestinians and oversees a brutal occupation. Watch this.
Do you believe, in your legal opinion, do you believe Israel's committing the crime of apartheid? Mr. Lametti, there is recruitment for a military force killing Palestinians, overseeing a brutal occupation.
Rather than cut away from this radical interrupting the press conference, our public broadcaster CBC News decided to give a national platform to this protester to spew disinformation, falsehoods, and anti-Israel hatred for over 2 minutes. On top of this, CPAC, a channel dedicated to political and governmental affairs, who also attended this press conference, decided to upload the entirety of it, including the interruption, to their YouTube page, which has over 110,000 subscribers. These decisions of broadcasting this can have severe consequences in the real world. CBC and CPAC gave an undue platform for an anti-Israel detractor to spread disinformation and propaganda, the likes of which have the potential to fan the flames of hatred, which creates potential for incitement against Jews, which again in 2021 was the most targeted group for hate crimes in Canada.
So that was just published a couple hours ago. I just saw this a couple hours from Honest Reporting Canada. I thought I would share that just because it was it was pretty funny, and I was made very happy. I didn't know that it had gone live, that CBC News World had shown my disruption live. But yeah, so I was very happy that was the case, and that. It's pretty amazing that Honest Reporting Canada, which of course I'm sure everyone's familiar with, is a anti-Palestinian FLAC organization, which basically tries to pressure media when they publish anything that is critical of their very extreme position in favor of basically everything Israel does. And it's an important, actually, part of understanding how the bias in the dominant media works is precisely FLAC and the ability of powerful institutions or powerful individuals to put pressure on media outlets. And it's one thing that I think that we actually sorely need in this country, which is a left-wing or internationalist, if you want to call it, anti-imperialist FLAC organization on a lot of these international issues, because reporters do respond to pressure. I as mentioned on the Radio-Canada enquête thing, the journalists that went down to Haiti, the fact that they were provided with information in advance, is part of, I think, why we ended up with some decent coverage of the Ottawa Initiative on Haiti. I have some other personal experiences putting pressure on journalists and actually seeing journalists change their position quite radically. But I thought I would leave it open to discussion, and if anyone has questions, comments, raise your hand, and yeah, go ahead, Yuri. you're muted.
Thanks, Steve. And by the way, very great disruption. Keep up the great work. I wanted to, well, actually, just sort of continuing on, on the topic of Israel. I was curious, what were any of the ultra Zionists' response to the murder of the Al Jazeera journalist? And at the journalism conference you were at, was there any talk about Julian Assange and the issue of censorship and suppression that governments do?
I didn't stay at the state of the call. I just participated in the one panel, and I left. I didn't stay for that. With regards to the killing, the murder, at this point, I'd say, we can't say 100% that Israel was responsible, but we're getting pretty close to 100% that Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, that there was I wrote a story about it. There was a bunch of people like Linda Frum, former senator. She's the chair of United Jewish Appeal Toronto, which is the biggest Jewish organization in the whole country. 2 different times she tweeted that those saying that this killing, that Israel is responsible, was a blood libel. I mean, she's like referencing, 500-year-old horrible Christian anti-Semitism for what is basically like, I mean, again, I don't think we can say 100% at this point, but CNN, B'Tselem, the Palestinian, all, showing that's, and I'll also point out, even if Israel wasn't, even if it wasn't an IDF sniper, which almost certainly was, Israel is still responsible as the occupying force that was engaged in the raids in Jenin. And, if it happened to be a Palestinian that did it, which again, it's almost certainly not, I would still put the bulk of the blame on Israel. So yeah, I mean, that's like basically it's craziness that's hard to get your head around. I mean, the pro Israel groups in this country are willing to go defend almost anything. And there was a rally in Toronto. Thousands of people rallied for Israel, the Israel Walk on Saturday. So at the same time that there was the Jewish supremacist march through Al-Aqsa Mosque and the very provocative move, there was a solidarity rally in Toronto. They boasted that they raised more money for Israel than they have in the 53 years of this Israel Walk. So all the mainstream human rights groups are calling it the crime of apartheid. All of them are saying Israel's committing the crime of apartheid. Top Canadian politicians go to Israel walks. Thousands of people attend. When Israel kills prominent journalists, those who are outraged, that's a blood libel. I mean, that's the political reality in this country. And again, if you look at human rights, the Honest Reporting Canada, what is Honest Reporting Canada? They're not saying, Yves Engler, I mean, they said Yves Engler is, anti-Israel, whatever. They are saying that the CBC and CPAC should have cut out, they should have edited, they were live at a press conference. They have to edit that because there happened to be some criticism of Israel. I mean, this is we talk about cancel culture and you never talk about, I mean, this is extreme. And they say this openly, right? And they get backing from, lots of, different prominent groups. So that's what we're fighting against. It's a very, very anti-Palestinian political culture we live in, and that's the necessity of doing things like disrupting the press conference. I mean, I was so happy. I didn't know this was on CBC News. I was so happy that Honest Reporting Canada, told me. I kind of heard. I thought maybe it appeared to someone on Twitter implied, but this whole, tens of thousands of people hopefully heard my a 3-minute intervention where I talked about the crime of apartheid. I talked about the murder of the Al Jazeera journalists. I talked about illegal recruitment in Canada. So, that's what, if the dominant media is not going to cover it unless you show up at a press conference and are vocal and break the rules, so be it. We have to do more of that. Go ahead.
Well, and actually, Yves, very quickly, what's going on with the police who arrested you for disrupting Melanie Joly?
The police didn't arrest me for Melanie Joly. I actually got arrested for trying to disrupt the U.S. ambassador, and that the court process is playing out.
Okay, hope it all works out for you.
Go ahead, Laura.
Well, I was just wondering, is there any Canadian politician at any level that demonstrates any kind of progressiveness towards Palestine? I'm Canadian, but I've lived in the US as a green card holder for decades, and I just don't know, are there any Green, New Democrat, any?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think what's happened in the NDP over the past 13 or 14 months arguably deserves like a PhD thesis. In April, Jagmeet Singh, the head of the NDP, in the lead up to their convention, participated in like just a shocking interview. I think it was the current, I don't know if it's CBC, I don't know if it's the current, where he gets asked about these resolutions supporting Palestinian rights to the convention. And he just responds 4 times, just talking about anti-Semitism. Nothing about Palestinians, just responds 4 times. Then the interviewer actually goes even more direct with the question, and he basically refuses to mention the Palestinian. Well, this was so outrageous. The backlash on Twitter was just instantaneous, and it was he kind of basically. I think by the end of the day, he actually puts out a tweet apologizing, but it basically just. Like the pro-Palestinian forces that were gathering in the lead up to the convention had 2 different resolutions that had huge backing, unprecedented backing. Basically, this gave them more and more kind of basically put the NDP establishment on the back foot on the Palestinian question. They were forced to accept to hear the debate on the Palestine resolution. That resolution then passed, which everyone knew would have passed if it was allowed to be debated, and it passed. And it's not an amazing resolution, but it calls for basically 2 main things: is ending our arms sales and ending any support for products from illegal settlements in the West Bank. And then the NDP then that passed, and then Singh, instead of trying to like hide it, said yes, basically came out, I think the next day or later day, saying, yes, we believe there should be a ban on not on the settlement. They haven't really talked about that much, but they picked up on the arms sales, no arms sales to Israel. And then the horrors of what happened last May came out quite soon after the convention in Israel, the attacks, and there's huge uproar of activism. And then the NDP raised that repeatedly in May, and then they kept it into their platform in the federal election campaign. And then simultaneously, Heather McPherson, who's the foreign affairs critic, has increasingly pressed Melanie Joly on the question on the Amnesty report about apartheid, and has pressed the saying, because Melanie Joly, the foreign minister, says, we don't believe it's apartheid, and so Heather McPherson said, well, based on what grounds? Are you like, did Amnesty make an error here? Did they make an error there? Is there something wrong with what Amnesty has actually published? Of course, the Canadian government has no like fundamental, substantive response. They just say, no, we don't believe it's the case. And so simultaneously, you have the MPs like Nikki Ashton, like Matthew Green, Alexandre Bourlis, Leah Gazan, who have been pro-Palestinian for a while. This is giving them more and more space. So a number of them have recently signed on to the "This is Apartheid" pledge. I think it's Independent Jewish Voices that instigated that fairly recently. I think I saw 4 MPs, but it's still like kind of happening. So I think some more might be signing on. So now you're getting like actually pretty openly, NDP, even Charlie Angus, who had been, I think, quite bad on Palestine. Like the CBC did a very good article on apartheid Israel 3 weeks ago or something like that, a month ago. I saw Angus sharing that. So basically, I would say the shift in the last 13 or 14 months within the NDP is quite a massive shift. Is it where it should be? Of course not. It's far, far from where it should be. Is the shift significant enough that it's kind of like we're never going back in other direction? I think it is. And if you know the history of how pro-Zionist the NDP and the CCF were, and they were very, very pro-Zionist, that famous quote from Tommy Douglas, where it says the only reason to be oppose Israel is because how well she treats her workers, from 1977, 1980, in that kind of range. Horrible quote. Just as one example, but yeah. So I think the NDP has shift dramatically on the issue. I don't like a lot of the NDP's other policies and all kinds of international affairs, but I think you have to give them credit that there are some important shifts recently on the Palestinian question. So I'm seeing 3 more questions. I think it might be all the time we have. We have Alex, Laurel, and then Nahid. You have your hand up, but I'll start with Alex. Go ahead.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, kind of related to the kind of sea change that we've seen in some parts of the NDP. This is definitely something I am seeing in just broader public life as well. I run a publication. I think about when we get pushback to certain things that we publish, and it's not coming from stories critical of Israel to the extent that I think it would have been even 5 years ago. So I'm just curious as to whether you see that too, like just a kind of, obviously parliamentarians are always going to lag behind public opinion by default, I suppose. So whether you're seeing this too on a kind of ground level, and also like, I think groups like Honest Report in Canada, like they seem to be swirling a hole of irrelevancy right now. Like, I mean, I don't know any real substantive victories that they've had recently. I think a lot of journalists quite rightly view them with ridicule and scorn. Yeah, just curious to your thoughts on that.
I agree with you that the terrain has very much changed. I wouldn't even go 5 years. I do think that in the last like 13 or 14 months, there's been quite a change. I think what happened last May, what Israel did was pretty shocking. Also, it's in the last, I think it's 18 months where all of Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, B'Tselem, the UN Special Rapporteur, they've all come out with very detailed reports accusing Israel of the crime of apartheid. So it gets getting harder and harder to respond to that for Israel supporters. I wouldn't say that Honest Report in Canada doesn't have an impact. I think they do have an impact. I think that there is still, I don't think it has an impact because most of the dominant media in this country already are, their tendency is towards Israel, and their tendency is towards the American empire, and so it's sort of coming in within that context. I don't think like Evan Dyer at the CBC, who I think is now become, is quite clearly sympathetic to the Palestinians. I don't think it's impacting him that much, though I think he would be more cautious with making sure he gets all his facts exactly right, because any small thing that they can pick up on. I would say, like, for instance, the video they just did that I just we showed attacking what happened. I think that the main people who wouldn't like this video Honest Report in Canada did is in fact the Liberal government, right? I think that Lametti, like, the Liberals are kind of playing this dance. They're shockingly pro-Israel, but most of the Arab and Muslim communities in this country vote Liberal, who tend to be sympathetic to the Palestinians. They want this to just sort of like be out of the media. That's the sort of liberal position. So Honest Reporting Canada, in doing this video, my presumption here is they're playing to their base, which is like, hard line, totally fanatical. This is about, fundraising and a whole, so playing to the hard base. On a personal level, that to me, this is just like, okay, you're just drawing attention to this disruption. You're just basically making me look good. That's how I see this. And then, but so in the middle there is Lametti and the liberal government that actually really doesn't like this, because they want less attention to this thing, and because they know that. I mean, no one. I mean, it's a very marginal few that will support violation of the Foreign Enlistment Act to recruit for the Israeli military. That's not many Canadians think that's a good idea if they get it presented in front of them. So I think the terrain has definitely changed. I said this, I think maybe in a previous thing. I even believe that part of the reason that Heather McPherson is been willing to kind of push harder on the Palestine question recently is partly tied to how bad she's been. And I think at some level understands that there's a sort of anti-war base of that are around the NDP that are really angry with her on Ukraine and whatever, and so but those people tend to be quite supportive of Palestine and want a sort of a pushing on the Palestine question. So part of why it's easier for her to push on the Palestine question, and it sort of deflects a little bit of the hostility she would be getting from some of the sort of left base on their sort of like aggressive pro-war kind of thing on Russia, Ukraine. I can't prove that, of course, but that's sort of my speculation, which is quite interesting. That's a real reversal, where previously it was like we stay away from Palestine because there's a pushback and whatever, but that dynamic I think has somewhat changed. There was who was the other person who had a question? I think you can raise your hand, or Nahid, go ahead.
I was so sorry.
Yeah, I'm low battery, sorry. First of all, I commend you for your courage that you're raising these issues with the media. I may have misunderstood. About 2-3 weeks ago, you did send an email in relation to NDP, Ontario NDP. And I think you said something different. I may have misunderstood.
No. So basically, in the Ontario election, this is a counter to the federal NDP, and that they are right. They have connections, but they are distinct. And this is very important point, and really disgusting what they did, which was the Ontario NDP, B'nai B'rith, which is a viciously anti-Palestinian organization. It's also viciously anti-left wing, right? They're trying to defund student unions all across the country. That the Ontario NDP, as part of the elections, they B'nai B'rith put out a questionnaire on on their issues, or how they frame it as issues that are concerned to the Jewish community. And in that, the Ontario NDP did two things that I think are clearly objectionable. One is they endorsed a little bit of a hedging language, but it basically endorsed the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which is a clearly anti-Palestinian definition. So it's used over and over again to try to basically, suppress criticism of Zionism, criticism of Israeli human rights violations. They also basically effectively condemned the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement to B'nai B'rith. So basically, in the context of the Ontario election, Ontario NDP thought that they should basically, I don't know if you want to frame it like that, be sort of deferent to or a grovel, if you like, towards a B'nai B'rith in the context of the election. In clear violation of what the base of the NDP, and not quite for the base, I'd say, mainstream NDP supporters believe, certainly the base with the IHRA. I don't think most NDP supporters in Ontario know what the IHRA definition and don't particularly care one way or another. But certainly then the base of the NDP, which has been campaigning on an issue quite a bit. So yes, that goes counter to some of the dynamics of what's happening within the federal NDP, and in some ways kind of expose like how kind of significant those changes have been at the federal level, that the Ontario NDP is sort of clearly behind. And I say that with regards to B'nai B'rith, I mean, I get it. Election campaigns are happening. Questionnaires are sent out by many different groups representing many different interests. I think it's a healthy thing for a political party to respond as much as they can to those questionnaires. That I get. But I think there is simultaneously a real question that has to be answered about, should he even respond to B'nai B'rith, let alone trying to say things that they want to hear? Should he even respond? I mean, B'nai B'rith is, quite intensely anti-Muslim. They've stoked all kinds of Islamophobia. Obviously, viciously anti-Palestinian. And again, they're trying to defund. They're part of a legal battle with the Ford government, supporting the Ford government bid to try to defund the Canadian Federation of Students, which is obviously, somewhat aligned with the NDP and trying to defund student unions across the country. So yes, what the Ontario NDP did is absolutely. I mean, I don't think there's any other word than disgusting kind of anti-Palestinian sellout. There was
excuse me, may I just ask another question? And I know we don't have time to cover it, but perhaps it could be addressed. If you can clarify in relation to Ukraine, two words. One is unprovoked, and the other one is illegal action of Russian. So let's agree that we know what Russia did was wrong, but the issue of, as you know, all the officials in Canada is always unprovoked Russian aggression. The unprovoked war, is it really unprovoked? What was the role of NATO? And the second one is illegal. I was listening to Scott Reiter, this American Marine. Anyway, he was explaining as actually Putin what he did. He did use one of the United Nations articles as part of protecting the Russian-speaking east side. On Monday, which was 21st, declared them as an independent entity, and then under that United Nations Charter, use that, I guess, because there was considerable escalation of attacks on the Russian-speaking population. So if you don't mind, for next time.
I'm happy to respond to that briefly here, and it could be another question. I think that Scott Ritter's, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm certainly not, my knowledge of international law is not that solid. However, having said that, I believe quite clearly this is a legal invasion. The UN Charter has some provisions that if you're about to be attacked, you can fight and whatever. I don't think you can seriously make that argument. So I think it's quite clearly contrary to international law, so illegal in that sense. Unprovoked, I think I believe completely it was provoked, and I believe that's one of the big propaganda kind of feats of how basically now you have to say it was like in the dominant media, or politicians are always refer to this as an unprovoked. It's not a war; it's an unprovoked war, right? And then Chomsky did a thing where he punched into Google "unprovoked war," contrasting Iraq in 2003 and Russia in February 24, and he found that it was like there's like 2 million in Google mentions of unprovoked war with regards to Russia's invasion. And he said like 10,000 with regards to what the Americans did in Iraq in 2003, when clearly what happened in Iraq in 2003, which is halfway across the world, you can't any plausible like American threat from what was going on in Iraq is just like laughable. So clearly what the US did in Iraq was far, far, far more of an unprovoked war, and yet it received very little attention, mentioned in that way. So I think that's a question. Somewhere down the line, I think it would be interesting to have on a lawyer that could break down some of these, had knowledge in international law that could break down a bit more of that, sort of technical side, not just on the question of, on legal wars, but I think some other legal things around sanctions. And I have vague knowledge of these issues, but I think that, having a lawyer on to break some of those things down would be quite interesting. And I'll think about that and, keep that in mind.
Get in touch with Alfred Desires. He would be good for that.
And then, so yeah, final question. I think Sim, was that you had a question?
No, that's okay. I just made my comment in the chat. I'm really happy that you met with the Canadian Association of Journalists, and I hope you're going to meet with them often. Because you really, it's like proportional representation. It's the right meeting the left, because let's face it, they do represent the right. So this gives a chance to kind of balance things a little bit and create more equilibrium. And obviously they're intrigued and they're curious and they want to talk to you. So it's really a good thing. I'm really happy. Congrats.
Yeah. Thanks. Justin Ling, who you might know, who he was in the room. He said, he asked if I was ashamed for having been on RT, having been interviewed on RT. So the debate ended up being quite a lively, dynamic, kind of heated affair.
That's good though. Debates are good.
I agree completely. And I would like in future Canadian Foreign Policy Hour sessions, I would like to have actually some debates where there really were, different perspectives being put forward. But so I guess probably leave it there. Just one thing in terms of like action. Again, I mentioned this last week, but I think it's really important to mention, which is the CANSEC, the campaign against the big arms fair. There's if you're in Ottawa, June 1st, so I guess that is Wednesday, early in the morning, 7 a.m. There's an effort to disrupt the launch of that, and there's also a demonstration, I believe, the next day in downtown. And so people should plug into that, as well as there's some online events taking place that people can plug into. So on that note, everyone, thanks a lot for participating, and just bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.